got this little, I don't know what this is, Phantom Bass. It's like a fish and ski, but really he just skis out of it. But his gauges aren't working, and he didn't know how much fuel he had. So, digging around a little bit, I think, and I'm gonna run a line down that, but I think that is for his sending unit, which is kind of up under here. Let's see, I made a cable. I didn't have purple and brown, so I made a cable, but I wasn't going to connect them yet because I also figured out, I think this is his bilge, because it's got, you know, a ground, and I'm not sure. So it's one or the other. So I just got to kind of trace a line. So what I'll do is probably use, you know, maybe we got a long wire, I can just tag onto that. It's kind of hard to do with it, two hands. I mean, you know, with one hand. The other thing that I discovered is this connector was unplugged. So when you got ignition on, it's going to send, this for your tag, but I think either that white wire, or if that's, it looks brown, but it might be purple, and then you got black. So purple should be ignition. So I'm thinking it goes up through here somewhere, and it should be a purple wire on this fuel, which is ignition, so it's turning this on. I do have lights here, but this tack wouldn't be working because this was unplugged. So that tack right there, the light comes on, so it's getting power, but then, you know, it couldn't have been working unless they ran a wire direct. So I plugged this back up, and I'm gonna crawl underneath there under the dash and see if I can't find the ignition. And then I can also, for the sending unit, I can make sure I have what wire is going to it. And then, you know, of course I don't know if they work, but I gotta trace first to figure out, you know, if we have signal going to it. Since I've got that end of that cable, I'm going to use my meter, put it on continuity. Hopefully you can see that. So I'll take one, you know, one of the legs here, and then I'll just probe with my other hot lead I got right here out of the dash. It's got a car light. I hate this light, but it'll work for what I'm doing. And so that's it. So now I know my purple wire going back there is good. And then I'll find out if my ground is ground, and then the cable I made, I can go ahead and crimp it. And then there should be a ground somewhere. So I'm just following the line that's like coming from here up, because at this point I'm not finding the brown wire. Okay, so this is a diagram for a tachometer with a trim indicator gauge, but then I also have the fuel gauge that I went ahead and just kind of wired, or showed a wiring diagram of it. I mean, there's lots of YouTube videos on this, but this is kind of like the boat comes to you and you don't know what somebody's done before you. In a perfect world, like all of it is wired perfectly, but in my case, lots of stuff came and it was disconnected. So on the fuel gauge, this is our fuel gauge. So on the remote of the engine that I have out here is a Mercury, and a lot of the Mercuries on the front, there's, especially the older ones, there is a harness that connects into the front of the control box, or you might have a wiring harness that comes up to the remote and ends up underneath. However that is, this one's showing like a 4-wire. In our case, we only have 3 wires. We've got a white, a black, and a brown. Okay, so white is going to be your ignition, right? So then we got 12 volts here. And that same 12 volts will be tied to this post. So there might be a jumper wire from 12 volts here. This powers it up. Okay, and then we've got ground. So this will be your ground, or your negative 12 volts. And I could... So like this is your negative 12 volts. Okay. If you're right. And then on ground here is your negative 12 volts. So these two will be tied together. Sometimes at the actual sending unit, which is on the tank, this ground sometimes will just be tied straight to the battery. Doesn't matter as long as this has 12 volts. Okay, and then you're going to have a jumper wire that's got or a wire that connects your light. So this is our light. So what happens is there is, in this gauge, there is a coil. Okay, it's going to go to ground, and then there's a coil that goes across here. I may be telling you the wrong too, because I think the coils are like this way. I have to look that up, but I believe that might be the case. So anyway, what happens is the sender has a float. As it goes up or down, it's going to change the resistance, and basically this sender is just, all it is it's just basically one big potentiometer, like a volume knob would be. So it's going to allow, like at full, there's almost no resistance, and then at empty, there's going to be more resistance. And they vary from gauge to gauge, from different manufacturers. So you can't just get the sender and replace in the tank if you don't know what the gauge is. So a lot of times they sell these together, and what happens a lot of times is just the sender fails. It's, again, it's just a resistor, and it's going to go anywhere from, like, I don't know, 30 ohms to, say, maybe 250 or 60 ohms, right? And so that resistance across that coil is what swings the arm in the front of this gauge. The arm reads from full to empty, or empty to full, and so then that arm, or that, swings depending on that voltage across those coils. So if you connected this to this 12 volts straight across that wire, you would probably damage the sender. Alright, if you measure this voltage at the sender, from sender to ground, you're going to see anywhere from, say, 3 to possibly up to high as maybe 6 volts DC. So on our 3-wire, we got white. That's tied to ground. That's giving us our hot, right? And then you got ground, the black side of the negative side of the battery is giving us 12 volts, negative 12 volts, right? And that powers it up, okay? And so then it's going to send a small amount of voltage to the sender, and that voltage drop across ground is how the needle's going to move up or down. So in our case, in this boat, this was disconnected. Some of the wires underneath the dash were disconnected, and that's all been reconnected. And what you can do to check your gauge, okay, you can unplug these 2 wires. If you touch them together, it should swing all the way to full. If it doesn't, then there's a problem. And then say you take a 100 ohm resistor, put across these 2 wires, this wire and this wire, or your sender, positive side of your sender to ground, it should read somewhere around half full. And if it doesn't, then you got a problem with your gauge. There's a problem with the wiring or something of that nature. Check grounds, make sure you got a ground from the battery, which I did underneath. Lay it on my back, and then you want to check and make sure you've got 12 volts here, and you can do that with your meter. And then, so back to our tachometer side, we have white that powers it up. We got ground, so that's powering the meter, right? This is just basically another meter. And then you're going to have a brown wire, right? That's our 3 wires out of this connector. And that's gonna give you the pulses. That's going to, again, go through like a coil. It's possibly like, like that. There's a coil, reads as different, and then that's going to move your meter. And then for your trim gauge, it's very similar. You got ground, comes over to the ground here, and then you're going to have hot, it's going to go to hot, and then you're going to have, in this case, in this wiring harness, you have a purple white wire that gives you the signal to tell you whether you're high or low on your trim. Let me just say this, in the case of this particular boat, they had from the battery hot going here and not coming from the wiring harness, which, like in this case, if I hit the master switch, it turns the lights on for all the gauges because it's turning the gauges on. And really we only want that to happen when the key is on the on position. Otherwise, when you turn your master switch on, you're turning the lights to the gauges. You may not want that at night. You may only want the gauges to light up when you turn the ignition key to the engine on. So that really needs to be changed out there. Somebody, obviously did it, and it was not the correct way to put it in. Basically, the wires for the sender were disconnected on this boat, so I found that wire. I had to go and use my meter to kind of read continuity to find the wire, right? And just use some little bitty jumper cables for your meter. Find the wire. Once I found the wire, made sure I had ground here on this one, and made sure this wire was good. And I made sure this is ground. And once I know this is good, this circuit was good going to the gauge, then I just had to make sure that the gauge's wiring was correct. So again, I actually think the coil goes across here and not here. but I'll have to look that up. I don't have an actual diagram for that. There's a lot on the web. Yamaha, Honda, Suzuki, all of them are going to operate exactly the same way. You just have to figure out what is your ignition wire, what color code it is, and then go from there. Because they're all going to be very similar. You know, you might have a gray wire for the tach. You know, you could have a brown wire. Just got to figure out what that is. Like, this brown wire is coming from, on the engine side, basically the tachometer, or you have a rectifier, right? And that rectifier, you're doing on a standard rectifier. You know, you got, say, they kind of look like a triangle, or I guess like look something like this, right? And they'll have two connections, and they'll have one. And so these two connections, they come up to the stator, and then you have this connection is plus 12 volts, because this is AC voltage, right? And that gets rectified to 12 volt. A lot of times it's 14. But you want to connect this brown wire, right? So if we drew over to this is going to be the brown. In my case, could be gray, you name it, but it's going to come from the engine side, brown, up to the tachometer. You know, they've got alt, so alternator. A lot of times on these you'll see, you know, like you'll see written on the gauge, on the fuel gauge, you'll say POS or positive, and this is going to say like GRN or GRD for ground, and then this is going to say S. You know, sometimes they might say I, you know, for ignition, and then ground and signal, and then this is your light bulb. So, and then these are, like I said, they're jumper together. So that's how it works. Very simple, very, very simple, you know, diagram. But it can be a little bit confusing when you get underneath there, and everything is all wired crazy. And just take your meter and go through it, you know, and try to come up with logically, it should look like this. Alright, so this is my wire that goes to the sending unit. And if I take, I've just got like a little pig and a jumper wire. So if I just take this and I stick it, you know, into my connector, and then just take the other end, right, and I connect it to this end, turn the switch on, it should go all the way to full, boom, and it does. So now I've got just 100 ohm resistor, more resistors, so we can just tie these together. A couple 100 ohms. It's going full. Let's check it here. It is moving it a little bit to like a quarter tank. On this particular one, I was wrong about that. So that's just one resistor at 100 ohms. So then we go to 200 ohms. So you can see the voltage came up quite a bit. And basically I needed to tie the two resistors together. That would add to the resistance. And the way I had it was just in series. And that was, I'd have to do the math and why it wasn't giving me the right reading. But anyway, that shows you that Like this fuel sending unit, you know, is going to have different resistance values. It's going to be how it reads. So on my gauge over there, we can see now, you know, it's with that resistance, which is about 200 ohms, we're, you know, 3/4 or so, right? So it makes sense that like 250 ohms would show about a full tank. 7 and 100 ohm resistor, so 207. You know, take the one resistor off, it's going to drop back down to a 1/4 tank. So you can see, you know, that the gauge is working, and but the sender is not working that I have underneath on the tank. Alright, so just to back up and talk about this, so this is the wire that's going to my sending unit, and then I just have a gator wire that's coming in, gator clip with a wire, and then I just added 2 resistors. I added 107, I think it is, 105 and 100 ohm resistor, so that makes it 200 ohms, right? And that puts us about 3/4 of a tank full on the gauge. And then if I take one of the resistors away, then we're gonna drop by half, right? So we're at about a 1/4 tank. So this gauge is working, but the sender's not, and it's not reading correctly. So so if you got some resistors hanging around, you can do this. There's a little experiment just to show it.
I used to hear 'em talking the story.